Hey guys, Fire here with my top 5 top laners for patch 3.15. Now I base this list primarily on their ability to carry and win solo queue, and I'll go through why they're here, how to play and build them, and also how to play against them. So at number 5 we have Nasus, and Nasus is really strong right now. He's kind of a ticking time bomb for the enemy team. He's really hard to shut down with the new defensive masteries, and best of all, he can just build defense while dealing a ton of damage. The reason he isn't higher on this list is purely because it takes him a long time to get going. He can get kited pretty easily, and I don't think he particularly carries as hard as others on this list. Now the new defensive masteries, Second Wind in particular, mean that his sustain is really strong, and it's really difficult to bully him out of lane. Now this was the reason Nasus wasn't played as much top lane before season 4. Sure, if he got those stacks he'd become really strong, but it was pretty easy to bully him out of lane. With the changes, he'll now most likely just farm early under his tower if need be, and then at level 9 he can actually beat most laners in a fight. I haven't put a specific build here, but I've put his core items, and it's really up to you in which order you get them. For example, if you're laning against an AP, then Spirit Visage is a good rush, and if you're against an AD, then Frozen Heart will be better, but you'll probably want most of these in your final build. Now Riven, Olaf and Renekton are 3 champions that have the ability to trade and shut him down early, which is why I've listed them here as counters. Nasus will eventually outscale you, but it at least gives you the chance to shut him down before he gets huge. And when you're laning as Nasus, you want to prioritise farming your Q unless your enemy is really aggressive. If you let them bully you and you don't trade back with the Q, then you'll soon find yourself at a healthy disadvantage and you'll start getting zoned from the wave. Now remember, Nasus' ridiculous sustain only works when you're hitting things, and if you get yourself zoned from the wave, then that's not going to help at all. The lane before your first buy is often the hardest for Nasus, and you may just have to let the enemy push your turret. Once you do have some defenses though, you'll be healing as much as they can damage you, and that's when you have a completely free lane. And one important thing on Nasus is to always ward, and it's not really to protect you from ganks, but it's to make sure your enemy top laner doesn't roam and snowball before you can get strong enough. Now when you're playing against Nasus, you really want to test him early to see if he's going to trade with you or let you bully him. The best way of doing this is to start trading with him as he comes to CS, because he's going to want that Q stack, so chances are he won't attack you and you'll automatically win the trade even if it wasn't ideal to start. As I said earlier, Nasus is really hard to bully once he gets items, so you want to zone him and not push the wave. He's good at last hitting under tower, and there's no way you can really kill him there either with his sustain, so just get the advantage and freeze the lane. Finally, the biggest tip I can give, and it seems obvious, is to ward and don't die to a gank early. If you die to Nasus during the period when you're supposed to be shutting him down, then he's just going to free farm, and that's really not good. Now at number 4 we have Riven, and I'm probably going to get a lot of hate for not putting her higher, but hear me out first. So now Riven snowballs really hard, but her lane phase isn't actually that good against other laners on this list. This is a big reason as to why we often see her mid lane now, because it's easier for her to lane against an AP mid than a bruiser. So Riven scales really well with items. Not only will her damage go through the roof, but it also gives you a better shield too, making it quite hard to kill her before she kills you. Now she also has a really high skill cap, a lot like Syndra, so the more you play her, the more rewarding it's going to become, and the more games you're going to win. The biggest reason why she is so dangerous is because she snowballs really hard, and if you let her get ahead, then you're in for a really bad time. Now when you combine this with the high skill cap, it means that if you're really good with her, you'll find ways to get yourself ahead, and that is just really tough to do anything about. Builds on Riven are pretty situational, but I've put an example build and then some other viable items on screen too. I will say that building defense rarely works on Riven though, except a Guardian Angel, and you'll stand more chance just building a ton of damage and trying to kill people than be hybrid. I've put 2 solid counters here that will both beat Riven in lane. Now the biggest reason I like these 2 over others is because there's hardly any outplay potential, even if Riven is a really good player. So laning as Riven is sometimes pretty hard, but there are a few things that you can focus on. So firstly, use your shield to block damage as it's coming towards you. Top laners often only have 1 or 2 damage abilities, and if you can block one of them with your E, you stand a much better chance of winning trades. People underestimate actually how much damage it does, and the best way of doing it is auto-attacking once between each use of Q. Now in teamfights you really need to play a little bit afraid and let the enemy use some of their damage or CC on your team and then go in. Riven is very much like a Vayne in having a huge target pinned to her, and chances are as soon as the enemy sees you, they're going to try and kill you. It's often also better to use Flash to get closer to your target rather than your Q and E, as both may get you there, but then you'll have no abilities left to kill them with. When you're playing against Riven, it's easiest to beat her by playing the cooldown game. Now when she comes into trade, just run away, let her waste her Q, and then zone her from the wave while that's on cooldown. Now if she does actually come back in to try and CS or trade with you, then just go ham. Most of her early damage is tied into her Q, so you're going to win that trade. After level 6, you need to be a little bit more careful as her ultimate can catch you by surprise, and the last thing you want to do is die to her. Lastly, the top tip is to build some armor. Riven really struggles against armor, and it's unlikely she'll be able to kill you after you buy some. This is why champions who build tanky and naturally do damage are really strong against her. Taking the bronze medal in this list is Rengar. Now Rengar is probably the most annoying top laner to play against as an AD or a mid laner because he will literally one-shot you in team fights. Now even more annoying, and the reason why he's at number 3, is it's so difficult to make him useless. Now if you manage to beat him in lane, which really isn't that easy, he can just build tanky and become really hard to kill. Spirit Visage synergizes with his W really well. His W itself gives him a ton of armor and magic resist, and he naturally does a butt ton of damage. And that's only tank Rengar as well. If he builds damage, then you'll literally just disappear when he jumps onto you. His roam potential is also pretty scary. Unless your top laner wards, then you're never going to see it coming mid because he'll just stealth in and nab a kill easy. You can even run bot lane after basing and stealth into the lane. There are just so many creative ways for Rengar to get himself ahead. Now when you combine all of this, it really just means that there is hardly any risk picking him, and he can carry as a tank or an assassin. Now I'll put 2 example builds on screen for tank and assassin Rengar, which will give you an idea of what to aim for. Jax, Renekton and Olaf do reasonably well against Rengar and at least make his lane phase pretty difficult. Now there are no real hard counters, but these 3 are at least skill matchups, so if you're good enough you will win that lane. Now when you're playing Rengar, the first thing you have to decide is whether you're going to try and build damage or defense, and you can normally decide after your first back. Now if the enemy laner is pretty passive or weak, then Assassin Rengar will carry harder by snowballing your lane in mid game. If it's a tough lane or against somebody who builds defense but still does damage like Renekton, then you'll probably want to go tanky. Now Renekton is also pretty unique as he can max any one of his 3 skills in lane and do well. So you're against a weak laner who you just want to kill all the time, then max your Q. Against someone who you're exchanging a lot of hits with, then max your W. And if you're getting zoned by someone ranged, just max your E. In general, you want to only trade when you have your W off cooldown, as the extra armor and magic resist will actually help quite a lot. Now brush control is also something pretty important. If the wave is in the middle of the lane, then just sit in the top brushes instead of out in the open. You don't have to jump to them, and they may even be stronger than you, but it's going to create extra pressure for free. Now one of Rengar's biggest strengths is his roam potential, so make sure you try to use your ult to either go mid or bot lane and grab some kills. Now as I mentioned, Rengar needs his W to trade, so when you're playing against him, the best way to beat him is to go aggressive when that's on cooldown. Now Rengar is not that strong without items, so you need to try and get an advantage during the first 10 minutes of the game, but just be careful with his ferocity stacks. Now remember that he has 3 abilities to gain those stacks with, and so if he already has 2 stacks, it means that he can get a full rotation and still use an empowered ability. Now finally mid game, when you're looking to team fight, make sure that you have a pink on you, and as soon as the enemy team is looking to engage, drop it right on top of you. Chances are Rengar is stealthing in from somewhere, and if you see him coming, then you can lock him up as soon as he jumps in, meaning he'll die incredibly quickly. Now letting him get the jump on you is one of the worst things you can do when you play against him. So at number 2 we have the Dragon Lady Shyvana. Now Shyvana has a lot of different things going for her. She does a ton of damage with no offensive items, she's extremely safe, she's a lane bully, and she's really hard to get away from in team fights. Now the reason I class her as a lane bully is because she can build to shut down the enemy's damage with armor or magic resist while still doing a butt ton herself. Now this is where it's kind of interesting because her damage is mixed. Now she does do magic damage with her W and physical damage with her autos and Qs, so early you can only build to defend against one of these sources. So not only is Shyvana strong early, but she's strong throughout the game, and if she gets ahead, she's literally impossible to kill while dealing a huge amount of damage. Now the scary part, and why she's number 2, is that she can get herself ahead because she's such a strong laner, and if you try to gank her, she'll just W and dragon away, making it pretty impossible to shut her down. There are champions that do pretty well against her, like Renekton, Mundo and Olaf, but Shyvana will just outscale them after the first 15 minutes of the game, and I don't think it's possible to get enough of a lead to negate the scaling. I put an example build here too, and in general you want to build defense with 1 or 2 offensive items. Offensive items are better if you want to split push, as you'll be able to 1v1 more effective, but tanky items will mean that AD won't be able to kill you in team fights. So when you're playing Shyvana, you want to focus on trading as much as possible. The best way to do this is to wait for the enemy to use their damage abilities and then go aggressive. Shyvana is exceptionally good at doing this because it's hard to get away from her when she activates her W, so you can't really stop her choosing when to fight. On the other side of this coin, if the enemy goes aggressive with everything available, you can just run away and not take any damage. Now poke with your E whenever it's available, and try not to use your W when you're next to the wave, as you can't really punish the enemy if they're sitting under their own turret. At level 6, you should try to look for trades left, right and centre. There is literally no risk in doing this, because if you start to lose you can dragon away, and if you're winning then you can dragon in. This way of playing will normally result in bullying the opponent out of lane, and if it doesn't then you haven't really lost anything except a low cooldown ultimate. Now playing against Shyvana is pretty tough, but try to keep a decent distance between you and move away when she activates her W. Now the duration of this is affected by how many hits she gets, and so ideally she's going to use the whole duration chasing you, at which point you can turn around and give her a good beating. Now Spirit Visage and the defensive masteries are actually pretty good against Shyvana too. Not only will you block a lot of her early damage, but you're also going to be able to sustain back up afterwards. Now finally you need to pick someone who can build tanky and do damage. Building damage against her is really just suicide. Not only will you do no damage to her because she'll be building against you, but she will really hurt you. So number 1 and the best top laner of all right now is Fiora. Now I'm just kidding, of course Mundo goes where he pleases and has wandered straight into the number 1 spot. Now the reason he is here is because he outscales everyone else and he can actually win his lane pretty hard. His ultimate is dumb as hell with the defensive masteries and he just doesn't freaking die in teamfights. In my opinion, Mundo is just another ticking time bomb for the enemy team, much like Nasus, because he's going to reach a point where he just can't be killed and that's really not good for your team. The reason it's such a problem is because he's going to outlast your front line by far and you'll use a ton of abilities to damage him, which just gets healed back up. He's kind of just like a sponge in a bowl of water. Now say the water is all of your team's damage, he'll just soak it up and then leave the water or run away from the damage, and his ultimate is like squeezing the sponge. So he soaks the damage, runs away, heals it all up, and then comes back and does the same thing, negating everything you just threw at him. Not only this, but his lane phase is not that bad. Early it can be quite hard and you'll get bullied, but you can use your Q to last hit in the worst case scenario. Now once you get some items and ranks in your Q, he starts to hit really hard and you can just poke them down to a point where you can bully them out of lane or even kill them. I've put an example build on screen, and honestly you don't even need to build damage on Mundo, but if you feel you need to, then Liandry is probably your best bet. Putting counters here is really hard because he doesn't really have any. You can punish him early, but he'll still become really strong anyway. The best matchups to go against him are Shyvana and Riven though, as both scale well and have a chance to shut him down early. And when you're playing as Mundo, you want to focus on farming and poke with your Q if you get the chance. Honestly, as long as you don't die and you get some farm, you're going to outscale your opponent anyway, so you don't have much to worry about early. Your Q scales really well with ranks, meaning that by rank 3 or 4, your poke will start to hit really hard and you can start to control the lane and free farm. Now another top tip is that if you do engage all in and they ignite you, just run away with your ultimate. The speed up will mean that you can get out to safety, and even if it means you don't win that fight, you'll be able to do it again in a minute with no ignite this time to stop you. In teamfights, your priority is soaking up as much damage as possible, and honestly you'll probably end up killing their AD at the same time. Hitting your Q in teamfights is really important though. Not only is it most of your damage, but it's also the only way you have to stick to people. Now when you're playing against Mundo, you want to punish him early as much as possible. Now dodge his Qs and then look to trade, as all he can do really is walk away with that on cooldown. Now pushing and freezing are both quite effective when you gain control of the lane. He's not that good at last hitting on a turret, but it also just eventually sustain back up to a point where he can fight you again if you aren't ranged. Now after level 6 you have to be careful he doesn't kill you, because he does a surprising amount of damage if he hits those Qs, and if you don't have ignite then you're going to have no choice but to run. The best way to actually kill him is to ignite just before you blow your load onto him. If you ignite too early, then he's just going to run away, so you need to use it all together. Okay, so there are two other laners who I think are really strong and good for solo queue, but don't deserve to be in the top 5. Now Renekton and Olaf are both lane bullies. They'll probably win their lanes 90% of the time, but they both struggle the later the game goes on for different reasons. So Renekton will just get kited. He ends up being a meat shield with some AoE damage, but I don't think he can really carry on his own. Now the reason for this is purely because the other tops on this list are going to outscale him and become stronger before Renekton can snowball the entire game. Now Olaf is more of a competitive pick rather than for solo queue. He's really strong, but he can get kited pretty easily once his ultimate runs out, and he's really just a huge front liner. He's a lot like Shyvana, but just not as good for solo queue in my opinion.